Ielts Writing Task 1, Lesson 1. In this lesson, I'll quickly explain what we're going to do on this video course for Writing Task 1. Similar to what we did for Task 2, in the Task 2 lessons, my aim is to give you methods and techniques, to look at the task, to break it into parts, and to give you a good approach, good methods for those parts. So, for example, of course, we'll look at the different types of Writing Task 1 question. A few things to remember before we start. The Writing Task 1, the task is to describe a figure, some kind of graph, chart, diagram you see. Your task is to describe it and write a report on it. You are not supposed to give your opinions. You don't know why the line on a graph goes up or goes down. You haven't got the research. All you see is the graph and you describe what you see. This we would call a report. It's the description task. So no opinions, first of all. And another important thing before we get going, I'll just say this now, no conclusion. Because a conclusion is like a final opinion, a final judgment. So we're never going to put a conclusion in Writing Task 1. You can put a summary in Writing Task 1. Examiners call this the overview, but it's the same as a summary. So if you want to put something general at the end of your essay in Writing Task 1, let's call it a summary and not a conclusion. So I've said that Writing Task 1 is a report, it's a describing task. We have no conclusion, but we do have a summary, and we're going to look at the different types of question. In fact, I'm going to define them as 6 different types, which I'll show you in a moment. And then I'll give you techniques for those 6 types, and we'll work on an example question for each one. I said we were going to look at the 6 question types for Writing Task 1. So here they are. Line graph, bar chart, pie chart, table, a diagram that's comparing things, or a diagram that's showing a process. I consider a map to be a type of diagram, so maps are included in either number 5 or number 6. Now, I always ask my students, what do numbers 1 to 4, line graph, bar chart, pie chart, and table have in common? I've highlighted those 4 in green because they're very similar. The reason is, the answer is that they have one thing in common, which is that they all show numbers. When you're describing a line graph, bar chart, pie chart, or table, you're just describing something that shows numbers. People often ask me, is there some special language that I need to know for pie charts or for tables? The answer is no. There's no special language. The language for those 4 types is exactly the same. It's number language. And the only things you have to do really are 3 things. You might have to describe one number, or for more than one number, you might have to compare. So you need some comparing language. You need to know how to compare numbers in a sentence. And the final thing with numbers is to be able to describe changes or trends. That's where you use your increase, decrease language. Those are the only 3 things in terms of language that we need to really worry about. Describing numbers, comparing more than one number, and describing these changes and trends. In fact, number 5, the diagram, you're using very similar language, describing and comparing things on a diagram. Of course, there are no numbers, but the comparing language is going to be very similar. The only one that has different language where you need to use something different is the process diagram. And we'll talk about that in a lesson dedicated to the process diagram questions later in this course. But in terms of language, just remember that it's fairly simple. We've got 4 types that are all the same, just showing numbers, and there's only this one type where we need to look at some slightly different language items or structures. Moving on from question types to essay structure. I'm going to show you now the 4-paragraph structure that I always use on my blog, my website, and with my students here in Manchester. If you've followed my blog lessons, you should already know this. Here are the 4 paragraphs that I suggest. Introduction, overview, which you can call summary if you want. The examiners call it an overview. And then 2 paragraphs of details. No conclusion. You notice I said that earlier in this lesson, but if you want, you can put the overview at the end. We can have a summary at the end. I personally prefer to put it second because I know how important the overview is for your score. So I do it just after the introduction, but it makes no difference. You can put it at the end as a summary if you want. Just don't begin with in conclusion. Begin with in summary or it is clear that, something that shows this is a general summary of the information. Now, moving on, the introduction. What do we do? Very simple. 1 sentence, paraphrase the question. So you take the question and you go through it bit by bit, changing the words if you can, maybe change the order. You don't have to change everything. Just try to change the key words in there. Anyway, moving on, the overview or summary. What do we do? Well, my advice is this is very important, so I give it 2 sentences. And in those 2 sentences, you're looking to explain or describe, the main general things. So look for 2 main things, 2 main points. You'll see what I mean in more detail when we actually do some questions later on this course. Then finally, we have 2 paragraphs about the details. This is where you include numbers and you do your comparisons, you're describing trends if there are trends shown. Sometimes people ask me, why do we need 2 paragraphs? Well, the simple answer is this makes you organize or group the information better. If you can, for example, if you've got numbers, you might put all the higher numbers in one paragraph and the lower numbers in another. Or you might put the first half of the period in paragraph 3 and the second half of the period of years in paragraph 4. Just grouping and organizing. This will help your score for coherence and cohesion. Makes your structure look better. And that's it. No conclusion, remember. That's the structure, and I've shown you the types of questions. In the rest of this course, we're going to go through those different question types. So next lesson, next week, we will start with the line graph question.
Vốn 300 tỷ, cơ hội việc làm và định cư rộng mở, hơn 100 trường hàng đầu và những con số 100 bí ẩn đang chờ.
IELTS Writing Task 1, Lesson 2, Line Graphs. Line graphs show numbers changing over a period of time. So you will always see numbers on the left on the y-axis and time on the bottom on the x-axis. And the lines on the graph show the numbers changing, going up and down as the time goes on. One thing you need to know before we start, you will not see a graph with only one line in your IELTS test. A graph like this would be too easy. You will almost definitely see 2, 3, 4, or even 5 lines on the line graph. Most common are graphs with 3 or 4 lines. And your job is to compare the lines, not to describe them separately. Do not write a separate paragraph about each of the lines. Make sure you compare them. And there's 2 types of comparison that you need to make. First, make a very general comparison of the lines on the graph, the information. This is for your summary or overview paragraph. I do this after the introduction as paragraph 2, but you could put the summary at the end. An example of this, if we take a graph with 4 lines, the overall summary would be something very, very general, like saying that the blue line is the highest overall, is higher than the other lines overall. And the whole period shown. Very, very general. Second, compare the lines at specific points. This is for your details paragraphs, paragraphs 3 and 4. Looking again at the graph for an example, with these 4 lines, there are many details that you could compare. I would start off at the beginning with the first year and compare the numbers there, but then there are many other choices and you have to select what you think are the main things. You might choose this point where the blue line becomes the highest and stays the highest for the rest of the period. You might choose to describe and compare the different increases or rises. You might choose the peaks on one or more of the lines. You might choose a stable period on one of the lines like this one. There are many things to say and you can't describe everything, so you have to select. My tip is write at least one thing about each line. Make sure you do some comparisons, and if you've got 1 or 2 things that you've said about each line, that should be okay. With that advice in mind, let's look at a line graph question now. Here's the question. The graph below shows electricity production in terawatt hours in France between 1980 and 2012. That's the question statement. Then we look at the graph itself. You can see the heading at the top, electricity production in France by source, TWH. TWH must mean terawatt hours. We can see that from the question. You don't need to understand what that means. Just use terawatt hours as your units in your report. You can see on the graph, on the y-axis on the left, those units 0 to 500, those are the terawatt hours. So if we're talking about 500, we'll say 500 terawatt hours of electricity. At the bottom on the x-axis, you can see the years 1980 to 2012. And in the box in the middle of the graph, we can see the sources of electricity: thermal, nuclear, hydroelectric, and renewables. How then do we write a report about this? Well, if you watched my previous lesson, you'll know that I have a 4-paragraph structure: introduction, overview or summary, details, detail. You can put the overview at the end if you want, but I prefer it second because it's quite important. Starting then with the introduction, we paraphrase the question. We just change some words. So the main thing to look at is the question statement here. The graph below shows electricity production in terawatt hours in France between 1980 and 2012, and we're going to just try and change a few words in there. We start with the graph below shows, and we can change that to the line graph compares. Then electricity production, we can change that to the amount of electricity produced. That's out in terawatt hours. We don't really need that. The next part is in France, which can stay the same in France. Now I'm going to add something. I'm going to add those sources where the electricity comes from. We can see in the graph those 4 sources. I'm going to put those in my introduction, using 4 different sources of power. And finally, we need to get the dates between 1980 and 2012. A nice way to change that is talking about the length of the period, over a period of 32 years. The full introduction is finished then. The line graph compares the amount of electricity produced in France using 4 different sources of power over a period of 32 years. Now we can move on to paragraph 2, the overview. 2 sentences, 2 main points. We're looking for some very general information on the graph. Let's look at the graph again. And the most general thing that I can see, the main point, is that the orange line for nuclear is definitely the highest over almost the whole period. We'll talk about that. And one more thing, let's just go to the opposite. The renewables are the lowest figures in the whole of the graph, the whole of the period. Let's write up in 2 sentences those 2 main points. First sentence about nuclear power being the highest. It is clear that nuclear power was by far the most important means of electricity generation over the period shown. Notice that I've made it a bit nicer than just saying nuclear power was the highest. I've said most important means of electricity generation. That's a good phrase. The second sentence was going to be about the renewables being the lowest. Renewables provided the lowest amount of electricity in each year. And that's my overview finished. 2 paragraphs done. Now we're ready to move on to the details paragraphs, 2 paragraphs, paragraphs 3 and 4, in which we compare the lines in more detail at specific points. We need to look at the graph again and decide what to put in paragraph 3 first of all. I always begin at the beginning with the first year, so I'm going to compare the 4 numbers in 1980, and then I'm just going to move on to this one point in 1981 where nuclear power becomes the most important, the highest for the rest of the period. That's all I'm going to put in paragraph 3. So here's my paragraph for paragraph 3. I wrote 3 sentences and I started with the first year, as I said, and the highest number. In 1980, thermal power stations were the main source of electricity in France, generating around 120 terawatt hours of power. That's the highest number in the first year. Then moving on, we add a comparison with the other 3 sources. Nuclear and hydroelectric power stations produced just under 75 terawatt hours of electricity each, and renewables provided a negligible amount. Negligible means very low, almost nothing. So I've taken 1980 and mentioned all 4 sources of power. Now I just want to add one more sentence about the year 1981. Just 1 year later, nuclear power overtook thermal power as the primary source of electricity. Overtook means it went above. That's paragraph 3 finished. Before we continue with paragraph 4, one important tip when describing numbers. You can't write nuclear was 75 terawatt hours of electricity, and you can't write nuclear produced 75 terawatt hours of electricity. It doesn't make sense just to use the word nuclear and the verb like that. You need to think carefully and don't just use the word you can take from the graph. You might need to change it. Here's what you should write. Nuclear power was used to produce 75 terawatt hours of electricity, or nuclear power stations produced 75 terawatt hours of electricity. So it's the power stations that produce the electricity, not just the word nuclear. Be very careful with the subjects that you use, especially when just taking the word from the graph. Look at this slide carefully and think about that point. People lose marks by doing this wrongly. Okay, on to paragraph 4. Let's go back to the graph and look at what we are going to select for paragraph 4. Remember, we can just take at least one thing about each line. Starting with the nuclear line, I'll just take this increase up to a peak in 2005. And I'll contrast that with the thermal line, the red line, where we had a decrease down from its high point at the beginning. For the blue line, we're just going to say it's fairly stable for most of the period, or all of the period even. And for the green line, we'll just talk about this increase at the end. So we've got one thing about each line, and we'll try and make sure that we compare or contrast when describing those numbers. Let's see what I wrote for paragraph 4 then. Again, another 3 sentences. First, between 1980 and 2005, electricity production from nuclear power rose dramatically to a peak of 430 terawatt hours. That's my sentence about nuclear. I'm going to contrast that now with the thermal power. By contrast, the figure for thermal power fell to only 50 terawatt hours in 1985 and remained at this level for the rest of the period. Next, hydroelectric power generation remained relatively stable at between 50 and 80 terawatt hours for the whole 32-year period. But renewable electricity production saw only a small rise to approximately 25 terawatt hours by 2012. That's paragraph 4 finished, and we finished the whole report. It's done. Remember, there is no conclusion in writing task 1. We've already done a summary. You can put the summary at the end if you, but write in summary, don't write in conclusion. To finish this lesson, let's look at the good vocabulary that I've used in that report. We'll look at the examples of paraphrasing and comparing language and describing changes that I used. We'll start with paraphrasing of electricity production that came from the question. Instead of electricity production, I wrote amount of electricity produced, source of electricity, provided electricity, generating electricity. I also used the word power instead of electricity all the time. Also, means of electricity generation. Instead of the years between and or from and to 1980 and 2012, I wrote over a period of or over the period shown. Those are good phrases to use for the years. Next, by far the most important. That's a good phrase, by far the most, by far the highest number. I often use that phrase in my overview paragraph to summarize. Next phrase, a negligible amount. That was a good phrase to learn, meaning very low, almost nothing, not noticeable. Nuclear power overtook thermal power. When I said it went above, it went past as the most important source. As the primary source of electricity, primary source is good, that means it's the main one. Rose dramatically to a peak of. When you're describing lines on a graph, you're going to use this increase and decrease language. By contrast, we did some comparing. The figure 4, instead of always saying the amount of electricity produced repeated many times, you can just say the figure for nuclear power or the figure for thermal power. Remained at this level, remained stable. That was another description of the trend. And saw only a small rise. It's nice to use the verb see in this way. You can say nuclear power saw a rapid increase or dramatic increase, but renewables saw only a small rise. You can do this with countries as well. The UK saw an increase in something. So that's the good vocabulary that you should have a look at when you print the worksheet. Vocabulary that you should have a look at when you print the worksheet next to this lesson. Have a look at when you print the worksheet next to this lesson. You can print the worksheet, watch the lesson again, and analyze each sentence carefully. There are some tasks on the worksheet as well that will help you focus on vocabulary and the structure, the linking, the comparing language that I used. So have a look at that worksheet and watch the video again. In the next lesson, we'll do a similar thing for a bar chart question.
Mọi người thường nghĩ kỹ sư là những người thợ.
Nhưng ở RMIT, chúng tôi nghĩ giữa chúng tôi, đây mới là những kỹ sư.
Chúng tôi
Ielts Writing Task 1, Lesson 3, Bar Charts. Bar charts can show numbers changing over a period of time. IELTS Writing Task about the view at the end if you want, but I prefer it second because it's quite important.